Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 816 for April 26th, 2020. Coming up in a few minutes.
The walls of Jack Rose are 95% empty for stuff that's still open by the dram. So there's literally maybe a few hundred bottles left on the wall.
Bill Thomas of the Jack Rose Dining Saloon in Washington, D.C. made headlines last month after the coronavirus pandemic forced city officials to order bars closed and limited restaurants to takeout service only. He started selling off Jack Rose's extensive whiskey collection to be able to keep paying his employees during the lockdown. While that has worked out so far, the road to recovery is still very unclear for bar owners all over the world, and we'll talk with Bill Thomas about that path. One of the possible solutions for some U.S. businesses is back on track after Congress approved additional funding this week for Paycheck Protection Program loans to small businesses. But, as we reported last week, that program has had more than its share of problems. Meredith Meyer Grelli of Pittsburgh's Wigle Whisky will also join us with an update on her fight, not with the government, but with her own bank that never submitted Wigle's application for the first round of PPP funding. That's coming up on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Your Voice, and on Behind the Label, what happens when your whiskey collection gets damaged at home. It's all ahead on this edition of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. This week would have been a big one for whiskey lovers. The Spirit of Speyside Festival was scheduled to begin on Thursday in Scotland, but like dozens of spring whiskey events, it's been canceled because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now the impact is reaching Kentucky, where some of this fall's major bourbon events are already being canceled. Friday, the Kentucky Distillers Association announced that its annual Kentucky Bourbon Affair Whiskey Fantasy Camp set for September has been canceled for this year. This would have been the first year for the event in September, after previously being held in June each year. Tickets had been set to go on sale for the Bourbon Affair, but KDA executives cited the potential for a second wave of COVID-19 cases this fall, along with the general uncertainty around holding public events. At practically the same time Friday, Danny Wimmer Presents, the concert promoter responsible for Bourbon and Beyond, Hometown Rising, and the Louder Than Life music festivals in Louisville this September. Now, since the KDA had already moved Bourbon Affair to run in between the Kentucky Bourbon Festival and Bourbon and Beyond, that leaves one remaining question: whether the Bourbon Festival will be held this year in Bardstown. The festival's board is meeting on Monday, as new Bourbon Festival President Randy Prosse told me.
Certainly all of these issues are sure to be on the talking points, but as of right now, we're planning to go forward, and every day it looks more and more like we might be the event in the fall.
Do you think you can safely hold the Bourbon Festival?
I think safety by then is certainly going to be clear. I mean, we're looking at a window of opportunity, right? I mean, everything from the CDC is looking like, we're going to get a reprieve here, as things pass, and then there could be a second wave in the fall, which, I'm looking at, November flu season is when everybody's going to be a little trigger happy, right? I mean, soon as the first person gets the regular flu, the windows and doors will be locked, and I think we'll probably spend the holidays like we are right now. But I certainly, based on everything I've heard from a national level, local level, regional, state, there's pent up demand for some events. And I think we're very well suited in that we're a small event by design. We're not selling 50,000 tickets for events. From a programmatic standpoint, we're taking into consideration that even graphic wise, our creative is going to be focusing more on the one-on-one social aspect of the bourbon and the festival, more so than the sea of bourbon aficionados descending on Bardstown.
You can listen to the entire interview with Randy Prosse in the news section at WhiskyCast.com. As of now, the Bourbon Festival is scheduled for the weekend of September 16th through the 20th. The biggest event of the year for the bartending community has also been canceled because of the pandemic. Tales of the Cocktail Foundation officials announced this week that they will be holding online events to make up for the cancellation of July's Tales of the Cocktail Conference in New Orleans. New Orleans has been hit hard by the pandemic after Mardi Gras events went ahead as scheduled in late February. Mayor LaToya Cantrell called last week for all major public events to be canceled through the end of the year. Tales of the Cocktail Foundation Executive Director Caroline Rosen told me they had already been preparing for changes even before that announcement.
This week we were actually supposed to be in Puerto Rico for Tales on Tour. And it was still a pretty early call to, call Tales on Tour off. And I can just remember talking to everyone down there, just the heartbreak. And I was like, what are we doing? Are we making the right decision? Are we making the wrong decision? Because it's tough. That seems like lifetimes ago now. It's like everything's been changing so quickly.
What went into the decision? I'm pretty much assuming it was automatic once the mayor said we can't do anything through the end of the year.
Yeah, it was definitely automatic at that point. And we had already started preparing for a very heavy digital presence because we service the hospitality community and the spirits community. And so many of our community have lost their jobs and we knew would not be able to travel in. So we had started to think about it, but that absolutely, when she called it, we knew that we needed to make a full change.
And you mentioned, obviously, all the lost hospitality jobs. I know that's affected New Orleans as well as nationwide. What are you trying to put together for a digital presence for those folks who would still like to at least be able to see some of the content that was planned for July?
Absolutely. What's happening in New Orleans and all over the U.S. and the globe, it's terrifying. It's really having a tough impact on us all. So what we want to do with Digital Tales New Orleans is create a space for community and education for what we need right now. We'll obviously have some Tales education that we've had about different spirits and obviously some history. But I think this year at Tales, you're going to see a lot more focusing on the now and how we get through this from a business perspective, from a mental health perspective, and everything that we do this year for Tales will be free. This will all be online. It will all be accessible. And so we're excited that in a time with such an instability that we're going to be able to at least hopefully virtually get everyone together and provide some of those tools that can be helpful.
Details for the online events will be announced in the coming weeks. In other news, police in Scotland have launched a cybercrime investigation into an attack by hackers on a multi-million-dollar online whiskey auction this week. Whiskey Auctioneer was nearing the end of the second round of its Perfect Collection auction, which featured whiskeys collected by the late American collector Richard Gooding. The online auction site was hit by two separate attacks. One was what's called a distributed denial of service attack, in which other, presumably hacked computers, hammer a website with millions of requests for web pages in an attempt to overload the targeted website's servers and crash the website. A second attack on the servers led to a possible compromise of auction data, according to a statement by Whiskey Auctioneer founder Ian McClure. That forced the postponement of the auction indefinitely. McClure declined our request for an interview while the case is under investigation, as did Police Scotland. At least 2 other online auctions were much more successful. Whisky.auction's charity auction this month raised more than £100,000 for the Drinks Trust, which will use the money to help UK hospitality industry workers affected by the pandemic. Last time around, I mentioned the IrishWhiskeyAuctions.com auction of a rare batch number 1 Pierce Irish Whiskey Collector's Edition set with the original 4 releases of Pierce, signed by the late Dr. Pierce Lyons and master distiller Jack O'Shea. That auction ended Sunday night with a high bid of €1,555. The proceeds will go to the St. James's Hospital Foundation in Dublin. A few new whiskeys to mention this week. Buffalo Trace has released its latest experimental collection whiskey, and this one has a more complex than usual history. It's a wheated bourbon that was distilled back in 2007 and put into the barrel at 57% ABV. 4 years later, that whiskey was taken out of the barrel and reduced with water down to 50% ABV, then put back into the same barrel and returned to the same warehouse for 8 more years. Master distiller Harlan Wheatley says it shows the role that water plays in whiskey production, and in a news release called it one of his favorite experiments yet. It'll be available in limited amounts starting in May, with a recommended retail price of around $47 a bottle. Grain and Barrel Spirits is coming out with another version of its Chicken Cock whiskey. This one is a straight rye that was distilled at the Bardstown Bourbon Company and is bottled in a replica of the old Prohibition-era Chicken Cock bottle. It'll be available for around $70 a bottle in 9 U.S. states, including New York, Illinois, and Kentucky, with wider availability in the coming months. There will also be a limited edition release coming soon. It's called Righteous Blonde. Last time around, I shared my tasting notes for the Last Drops 1977 Dumbarton Single Grain Scotch. Got word this week that the Last Drop is now releasing its final bottling in a trilogy of vintage Glenrothes single malts. The 1970 is the follow-up to the 1968 and 1969 Glenrothes releases. There's no word on pricing. The Cotswolds Distillery in England has released the first whiskey in its Hearts and Crafts single malt series. This one is matured exclusively in Sauterne wine casks and will become part of an annual series. It's available only in the UK and through the distillery's website for around £75 a bottle. Finally, longtime Australian whiskey brand ambassador Dan Woolley is launching his own whiskey brand this week. It's called The Highwayman, and it's distilled at Australia's Lord Byron Distillery, located just south of Brisbane along Byron Bay. Dan, congratulations. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, where they're making hand sanitizer as well as whiskey right now, and donating the hand sanitizer to hospitals and first responders to help combat the spread of COVID-19. Heaven Hill urges you to join the fight, stay home, stay safe, and enjoy one of the 360-degree virtual warehouse tours, guided tasting experiences, and Season 1 of the Tales from the Hill podcast. You'll find them all at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Just a quick program note now. We have 2 more live webcasts on tap this week on Wednesday and Friday afternoons. This Wednesday, we'll be joined by Kaveh Zamanian of Louisville's Rabbit Hole Distilling, Paul Hlutko of Few Spirits in Chicago, Louise McGuane of Ireland's Chapel Gate Whiskey Company, and Michael Henry, the master blender for Loch Lomond Spirits in Scotland. Friday, we have another Writers' Roundtable for our Happy Hour webcast with Liza Weisstuck, Dominic Roscrow, Tash McGill from New Zealand, and Emma Briones from TotoWhiskey.es in Spain. And looking ahead to the following week, we have just confirmed that the one and only Richard Patterson of White & Mackay will join us on the Whiskey Wednesday webcast on May 6th. Our panelists will discuss your comments and answer your questions, so please join us on Wednesdays and Fridays at 5 p.m. New York time. That's 10 p.m. London time and 2100 GMT elsewhere in the world. If you have suggestions for guests you'd like to see on one of our webcasts, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to share them with us. Time now for the calendar of events brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distillery. I mentioned last time around that we were waiting for an update on Whiskey Live in Tel Aviv, Israel, which had already been moved once to May 13th and 14th. Got word this week that it has now been postponed until sometime this fall, with a date to be announced later. We do know that the Somerton Whiskey Festival will go on as scheduled May 30th, since it's been turned into a virtual whiskey festival online. As of now, the Beer, Bourbon, and Barbecue Festival is scheduled to take place in Wilmington, North Carolina on June 6th, and in National Harbor, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., June 20th. Look for an announcement soon on the status of the Indie Spirits Expo scheduled for June 8th in New York City, and as of now, Buffalo Trace Distillery still plans to hold its Pappy for Your Pappy Father's Day weekend event June 19th in Frankfort, Kentucky. Woodford Reserve Distillery is also still planning to hold its Bourbon Academy class on the 20th in Versailles, Kentucky. The Whiskey Obsession Festival is still scheduled for its third date of the year so far, June 25th in Tampa, Florida, and Whiskey Live in Sydney, Australia is still set for June 26th and 27th. Of course, everything should be treated as tentative right now. Event plans are subject to change on short notice depending on the status of public health requirements. So make sure you double check on the status of any whiskey event you're thinking of attending before you make any travel plans. We'll keep updating the calendar at whiskycast.com as we get word from event organizers. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of Virginia's most awarded spirits, including the Roundstone Rye and Rabble Rouser Bottled in Bond Rye. They do it all with renewable solar energy. In fact, you can actually see how their solar array is doing in real time at their website, catoctincreekdistilling.com.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. While we don't yet know how long it will take before life returns to normal, or even what the new normal will be, it is clear that the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic will be felt for many years to come. Many of those affected most by the lockdowns that have crippled economies around the world are small businesses, which often barely manage to make ends meet in the best of times. Governments have been trying to help those businesses make it through the pandemic with economic relief packages, but few countries have been able to do it effectively so far. This week, the U.S. Congress approved a second round of funding for small business relief programs after the first round ran out within days due to demand. And last time around, I reported on the problems Pittsburgh's Wigle whiskey had with the Paycheck Protection Program after its bank dropped the ball and never processed the distillery's loan application. Wigle co-founder Meredith Meyer Grelli was not available for an interview last week. Like many small business owners, she's been busy juggling chainsaws these days, but she did have some time to spend with us this week.
You know, every day is new and different. And so we've just continued to try to be flexible and come up with new ways of operating. So when COVID hit, we had just opened our new tasting room, expanded restaurant and bar and mini museum at our distillery. 2 days later, of course, we had to shut all 7 of our sites down. And we transitioned overnight into an e-commerce business like so many other small businesses did. And we started to really get the hang of that and get to the service levels we were hoping to get to over the past 5 weeks. And we've been living in a somewhat artificial environment in Pennsylvania as our state-controlled liquor stores shut down. So we were one of the few outlets consumers could come to for spirits. So that has kept us busy the past few weeks. And then this week, the state opened up a number of its sites for curbside pickup. And so, of course, that has had a significant impact on our business. So we're sort of readjusting again. And we are also, continuing to monitor the governor's statements and actions to understand what kind of timelines we might be looking at for reopening our site.
This has got to be nerve-wracking as one could ever dream of when running a small business.
It definitely keeps you on your toes. There's been, a sort of a good big challenge every day. I often say that a year in a small business owner's life is like 3 years of normal life. And I feel like now it's more like 7 years. We are definitely working around the clock, trying to be nimble, agile, pivot as we need to. And, in some ways, I'd much prefer that than, we're lucky to have any option to sell anything right now. So many people are completely sidelined. And that, I think, would be much harder to just be stuck with no options.
And one of those options was closed off to you with the PPP financing.
Yeah.
Explain what happened here, because it looks like if I owned a distillery that was in that situation, I'd be having a chat with my lawyers about now.
Yeah. Well, we're doing our best to understand exactly what's going on, but we applied for the Paycheck Protection Program on the first day that the application was to be accepted by our bank, which is PNC Bank. And we completed the applications in full for both Wigle Whiskey and Threadbare Cider and Mead. And our application sort of sat languishing with PNC for the entire time that the program existed. We had completed everything that was required and asked of us through their application process, but it just got caught in some computer albatross sort of black hole. And so the program ran out of funds, as everyone is aware, and our application never made it past, apparently, the first desk at PNC. And this go-around, PNC has been more responsive, and we've been working with human beings there who have moved our application along so that we're now in line, should there be enough funding, with this second go-around. So we're very hopeful and, trying not to be too optimistic about it, but we're definitely better positioned now than we were in the first go-around. We don't have visibility as to exactly where we are in this national queue of small businesses who are all feeling the same desperate need for this loan program, but at least we've made it through PNC's internal processes.
Did they give you any explanation at all for what happened, or even an apology?
Well, the most we've gotten is that, they were simply overwhelmed, which we can definitely understand and appreciate. We're all in this position of being overwhelmed and unprepared for this. I think they have done a much better job the second time around of being responsive to their small business customers. I think in part what is so frustrating to small businesses like us is this funding is so critical to us as we all stare at potentially 6 to 18 more months of reduced or eliminated operations. And for your business's survival to be reliant on someone in PNC to just sort of move it forward in their computer system is mind-bogglingly frustrating if you spend a good portion of your life building a business. And I think it does not help that there is a perception, whether it's true or not, I think will come out in time, but that larger customers were favored and prioritized and given different treatment than small businesses.
And that's got to make you mad, because when you see publicly traded companies and people like Shake Shack that had $100 million in the bank getting money from this program, when they're sitting on $100 million in cash and you could use even a tenth of what they got.
Oh, not even a tenth. Yeah, I mean, I think at the PNC level, what we saw was that when you went to submit your application originally, there was a note on the website that if you had $5 million or more in accounts with PNC, you were to apply in one way. And if you went that route, you got personal attention and guidance throughout the process. If you did not have $5 million in accounts with them, then you had to apply through their online system, which we all know now failed many, many small businesses, including ours, and which no one would respond to your requests or questions or follow up. And for us who run a small business, we look at that $5 million number and think, what small business in Pittsburgh has $5 million sitting in any bank?
Yeah.
That is, if you're a small business owner and you have $5 million, holy cow, first of all, because that's an extraordinary amount of money. And second of all, you are deploying that like crazy. You're buying equipment. You're hiring people. There's never $5 million sitting in your bank account.
Unless it's your side hustle and you're making your money somewhere else.
Right.
So what lessons have you learned from this?
Well, on the positive side of things, we've learned that our team is incredibly flexible and can just endure and bring their spirits to a lot of challenges. This has definitely been the most challenging month in business we've had in the past decade, and we're doing well. We're surviving. Our core team is intact and moving forward, and I'm confident we will come out of this. We've been able to adapt very quickly. As far as the bank situation and the loan situation, certainly this is a program that moved quickly, and I think there's great benefits to that. And the costs to that are that the funds don't always necessarily end up where the original intent was. I think it's clear it's probably better to be bigger. I think one of the other things we've learned through this loan process, though, is that small community banks did largely, at least in our region and the ones that we've talked with, did a much better job and were much more effective at handling their customers' loan applications. I spoke with one regional bank that had 100% success rate because they prioritized their small businesses and their people worked around the clock on getting every single application through their process.
Is it fair to say that you might be changing banks at some point in the near future?
We haven't given up hope entirely, and we always try to give all of our current partnerships priority, and PNC has been working with us much more closely the last 4 to 5 days. They definitely seem to be watching all of this more closely and taking care of more of their small business customers. So we have not given up hope entirely.
For the record, we talked before Congress approved the second round of funding on Thursday, and it was signed into law by President Trump. I should also note that we did contact PNC Bank executives for an explanation about the problems with the loan program. We have still not received a response. Now, bars are still closed in almost every U.S. state and in many countries around the world to help prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Thousands of bartenders, waiters, and other bar and restaurant workers are out of work right now as a result. Earlier this week, the owners of the Proof Cocktail Bar in Calgary, Alberta, did something that's become more commonplace than I think we'd really like to see. They sold a sealed bottle of Old Rip Van Winkle 10-year-old bourbon to help keep the lights on, as they put it on their Twitter feed. While the final price has not been disclosed, the bar said it expected to keep the price in line with recent Canadian auction prices, which would put it in the $1,500 range. And we had a story a couple of weeks ago out of Tampa where the owners of Dats decided to sell a rare Pappy Van Winkle 25-year-old bourbon to help pay their employees. They had hoped to raise $20,000, but a generous collector came in with a cashier's check for $40,000, which helped them bring some people back to work. And over the last month or so, East Coast whiskey lovers have lined up, 6 feet apart, of course, outside the Jack Rose Dining Saloon in Washington, D.C., which has one of the largest whiskey collections of any bar in the world, somewhere close to 3,000 bottles at one point. Bill Thomas and his partners own Jack Rose and the Imperial nearby, and they've made a big dent in that collection to keep their employees paid while preparing for the day when they can reopen.
We've been selling all of our inventory.
Right.
Everything was on the walls, and we're also getting a new inventory every day, either from our personal stash or from the distributors, because there's new whiskey still coming out all the time right now. And we've got it set up so we'll allow 2 to 3 people in Jack Rose, which is crazy if you think about Jack Rose, considering it's a 7,000 square foot building, and you're allowing 3 customers in, and they get to peruse the shelves, and we can sell bottles to go or drams to go.
And you're breaking down bottles into dram size samples, right?
Correct. Yes. And in fact, and now that we've been at this just over a month now, the walls of Jack Rose are 95% empty for stuff that's still open by the dram. So there's literally maybe a few hundred bottles left on the wall that are open by the dram. And in 3 weeks, we will begin to restock the entire wall, thousands of bottles for whiskey strictly by the dram, and for reopening when this is all over.
And you say 95% of the shelves are empty, but there's still a few hundred bottles, which is more than most bars would even have at 100% capacity.
Yeah, it's kind of funny to think like that. Yeah, even I remember when it was down to 800 bottles, and I was like laughing. I was like, still a pretty big selection considering. But it's crazy. It's like I've stepped back in time. When I first bought this building to do Jack Rose was 2007. It's 13 years ago. It took us 2.5 years to build it. So I guess it was late 2007, early 2008 when I bought the building, and then took us 2.5 years to get it completely gutted, ripped off the second floor, rebuilt it, and then started stocking. So it's like starting from scratch again.
How hard was it for you to let some of those bottles go? Because as you've noted, some of those came out of your personal collection.
Yeah, I'd say the vast majority came out of stuff that I had hunted over the years. Well, there's been it's been kind of bittersweet. In one way, there was never a thought of not doing it, or I should say, once the mayor, and she acted fairly swiftly in D.C. We were lucky enough to have a mayor who was like, okay, what else can we do to help? And this is one thing that they came up with almost immediately. So it was only about 7 days between the time of we realized that we were going to have to close and the time of doing this. I had already contacted a real estate agent to put my house up for sale, so I could start covering the debt, the outstanding payroll, the outstanding invoices, paying off health insurance for a few months. We're doing groceries for all employees from both of our restaurants that were open. We have 70 employees that we're feeding. We're bagging up 125 bags of groceries right now in the kitchen for tomorrow's pickup, the staff. So we needed the funds. So, I literally probably, had she not done this so quickly, I would have sold my house probably, it was a week later. So if she had waited a week, I probably would have been under contract. So this is great. I got to keep my house, and I'm selling the product. The staff is happy. The staff is fairly healthy. Everyone's doing pretty well. So, that's all it was. I mean, it wasn't even a thought. The immediate thought was, okay, we have to do this. What's the best route? First, it was my house. Then, screw it. Then the mayor acted fast, and I was able to get the whiskey on the market.
So, how much do you have still in reserve in wherever it's in that secret undisclosed location, the bunker or wherever, where you keep all the other old stuff? Yeah,
between myself and my partners, we've got access to probably another, I don't know, 13,000.
Wow.
Bottles.
13,000.
Yeah, roughly. That's a rough estimate. Could be less. Could be 12.
Oh, only 12,000. Okay.
We're hustling. We've always been hustling. We've always been, like I said, we were planning this place for 100 years. We just had our 100-year plan collapse to a 6-month plan. That's all. So we'll be okay. We'll be on the other side of this. We'll be fine. We'll have a little bit of debt. There'll be some restocking costs, obviously, and there'll be some growing pains at the beginning as they go to partial opening, social distancing. Wouldn't surprise me if we lose money for a little while based on that. But we need to get back up and operational. We need to get the people fully back employed, get revenues going. So it's just a challenge. But when you're thinking, the fact that we were thinking that far out, it gave us that opportunity to do this. But I'll tell you this, Mark, we'll restructure the company completely after this. In terms of we have to rethink, all of us have to rethink our business models in terms of longevity, in terms of when this happens again. And obviously it may not happen to this extent, but it will happen again. It may flare back up in the fall. We have no idea, but we need to be planning, which means not just being dine-in. It means, whiskey to go, takeout, delivery, the whole 9 yards. We have to rethink our business model so we can anticipate downturns or shifts in the market that keep us relevant. It also means we have to build up a much greater cash reserve. We're going to need to keep 100 to 200,000 in reserve and capital at all times as well. So we'll just have to regroup, and I'll redo the business model, and we'll go from there.
This is really a lesson that everybody in the restaurant and bar business is going to have to learn and get through, at least those who survive this thing. Right.
And unfortunately, I think there's going to be maybe up to a 50% shakeout in the restaurant and bar business, after this. And I think it might come in stages. I think there's going to be a stage of those who don't open, who already know they're not coming back. They were already, under too much strain as it was, high rents, mortgages, staffing issues, whatever. They're not coming back. They'll be the ones that struggle to come back and realize very quickly that, they just can't make it go. And they'll be the ones that, if they're lucky enough to get any sort of stimulus money or have any loans, when those loans start coming due and the business hasn't fully matured, you'll see maybe a third wave of closing. So it's going to be, we're going to see the staggering effects of this 100% throughout 2020. And we're really not planning on, getting back to a full swing till 2021 is our guess. I live with an epidemiologist for the Department of Defense. So when I leave Jack Rose, and I'm at Jack Rose every day, all day, I'm here pretty much 10, 12 hours a day. I go home and I'm like, what's the updates? And it's never good. So it's crazy.
You ever think you'd see anything like this before when you got into the bar business?
It's funny because I grew up on the stories of Prohibition. My great-grandmother, we opened up our first bar here in Washington, D.C. in 1885. So, I grew up with the stories of Prohibition, but it was, all the stories I grew up with were how they overcame the revenue men, how they, even how they got stuff to guys and, family members who had to went to jail, like getting them what they needed in jail. It was always just like, okay, we had adversity, you overcome it. And, I used to joke some of the problems that I've had over the years, and I'd be like, stop bitching. Great-grandmother went through Prohibition. She had real problems. But then COVID comes up, and this is a real problem. This is a problem that is the problem here is it a one-time thing? Is it an every 5-year thing? Is it going to have varying degrees every other year? We just don't know. I mean, there's so much uncertainty. It's like potentially having prohibition always lurking and waiting to pounce on you. And I think that's how you have to look at it. You really have to be that super conservative person that plans for the rainy days, but hopes it never comes. That's exactly the business model that I will be pursuing. Is I'm going to plan for torrential downpours and just pray that they're far apart from each other.
The stimulus packages that have come out of Capitol Hill, just down the street from you guys, have not exactly been restaurant friendly in terms of what you would need to be able to restart your business and get restaurants back and running when you can't serve in-house, when you have to do takeout only. It's kind of hard to bring all those waiters and waitresses and cooks back and all the staff that you would have for in-house dining and do that in the next 8 weeks when the loan is going to come due for how many people you rehired when you don't have any income coming to pay that.
Absolutely. So obviously it's not structured. They have no idea about restaurant margins and how little and how close people run their margins in the restaurant business. So you have the situation where, there's free dollars, which of course everyone wants, but there's obviously not going to be enough of. So get rid of free dollars. So what you're hoping for is deferments of sales tax, deferments of property tax, deferments of licensing fees, whatever you can do. But with razor thin margins, you have to amortize that over a long enough period that a restaurateur can continue to operate, continue to make a living, and continue to make those additional payments. So when people start talking 1 year or 3 years, I just laugh. I was like, are you kidding me? It's got to be 10 years. I mean, if you're not thinking 10 years for a restaurant to recoup these things, you're going to, under 5, you're talking about absolute collapse anyways. People would only take that money knowing that maybe it would forestall the inevitable, which is like that third wave that I'm talking about of when loans come due, deferred payments come due, and they just don't truly know. And this is so typical of, there's members on our city council here that on other bills that have come up over the last few years, they have no idea how business, they've never run a business, they've never run a small business, and not just in our industry, but in a lot of other industries. And they just write things without truly consulting the people that actually know. Obviously, Congress has really done, I think, a poor job. I mean, even the threat that even if there is potential help and that it could run out, that if you didn't get your application in 5 minutes before another small business person, you survive, they don't, or vice versa. That's just a crazy way to create, a policy that's going to help small business. I just don't, I don't understand it. But, we're not sure if we're in the pipeline. We haven't gotten acknowledgement that our application for PPP was even accepted or whatever. So, I mean, obviously, I don't think we are in the first round of money. Perhaps we would be in. But once again, like talking to my partners, I'm like, depending upon the qualifications of rehiring, spending that money, the 75-25 rule, I looked at them as like, I don't know if I would take it anyways, because would it be beneficial for us? Would we actually meet the qualifications? If we don't meet the qualifications, then it turns into a low interest loan. How long is that loan due? I mean, if we do dole out the money and hire staff, but then we don't actually have revenues coming in, and then it turns into a loan and we doled out that money just to staff, all of a sudden we've just basically borrowed money to give it to someone else that we have to pay. It's very, very difficult. I think the best thing, and is to approach it holistically. And that's what, our mayor did with this particular bill of selling your product. It gave me an ability to help myself. Now I'm one of the few people that probably has a greater ability to help themselves than others. And I count myself very lucky. But it's, we're going to have to be thinking down the road what other potential deregulation or additional privilege can be given to the restaurant industry, and in particular alcohol sales, to allow us to succeed in the future.
We should explain that because you operate in the District of Columbia, you get a benefit that pretty much nobody else gets that runs bars around the country, in that you can actually bring stuff out of your personal collections, and you can go get the rare bottles and get these in-demand bottles a lot easier than most people can. And explain how this works in D.C., because of essentially being a self-regulated within the district system as opposed to having to answer to a state liquor board.
We still have the oversight of alcohol beverage control. And obviously they are very progressive. Obviously the mayor is being very progressive. But our ABC board was already taking additional steps even prior to this. I was having meetings to them the week before COVID about additional allowances for restaurants and bars. I was fighting, just like for what we do here, which is allowing us to bring in additional alcohol from outside vendors or individuals or, auctions, filling out an additional permit, paying an additional tax, and then being able to put it on our shelf. There was a time that was a policy. Then they tried to close that, and I had to lobby to keep it open, which has benefited the whole city by me lobbying to keep it open. So obviously Kentucky was based largely on what we do here. I mean, Kentucky has amazing laws. Kentucky's law is actually even more comprehensive than what we have here in Washington, D.C. Obviously, there's good reason for that because I helped advise on some of that with the anticipation of me coming to Kentucky, and yet that still hasn't come to fruition. So that's how D.C. benefits. That's how Kentucky. That's how Gary Crunkleton down at the Crunkletons has been able to do it. I think, North Carolina or South Carolina. I can't remember if he's North or South Carolina. But we're starting to see other cities open up or states open up and go this route simply because the demand from people, from patrons, are for vintage pours. So,
what do you think Jack Rose looks like a year from today?
A year from today? Yeah, the funny thing is, I'll tell you this. The one great thing that's coming out of this is we are literally, myself and my whiskey advisors, are trying through so many bottles that we're seeking out right now from importers, from collections, and we're opening them and we're like, is this good enough? Jack Rose, I think what you're looking at another year from now is a tighter inventory, perhaps not nearly as many bottles, but not nearly as many bottles because we can't put them on the shelves, but nearly as many bottles because we won't put them on the shelves. So we're already looking at it and saying, okay, wait a minute. Who didn't deserve to be on the wall in the first place? What whiskeys have phoned it in? What companies have phoned it in? What brands have phoned it in? So we're looking at this as an opportunity to tighten the quality of the bottles so that when a patron walks in the door, you can almost throw a dart at any bottle and be like, that one's a good one, So it's not about numbers. It hasn't been about how many bottles you've had on the wall for 5 years. I mean, that whole debate was so long ago. That's such an archaic thing to even measure a restaurant or bar by. It's the quality of the bottles. I always joke and say, I'll go to the right bar with the right 10 bottles and have a great night. I mean, there's only so many drams you're going to have in the evening. What you want to see is the best drams on the wall and a rotating inventory of drams on the wall. That's the key. So when we come back, I'm seeing a smaller selection, and by smaller, I mean, who knows, 2,000, 2,500, I don't know, somewhere in there, probably two. Let's just round it with some of the best bottlings. Like right now, I'm trying through, not just bourbons, but scotches and Welsh and Canadian, and we're picking the best ones. And right now, I'm trying to be like, okay, keep 3 bottles of this, keep 3 bottles of this, 3 bottles of, we're trying, Japanese. I've tried through like 40 different Japanese whiskeys in the last probably 3 weeks. I'm like, this one makes the cut, this makes the cut, this makes the cut. These don't reorder, that's it. So that's what we're doing. We're really just kind of honing our skills, honing in on the best bottles that we can. And I've got an opportunity right now that we're still buying. We buy every week. I've literally gotten in $10,000 worth of whiskey in the last 3 hours. So we're just picking the best stuff. So right now it's an opportunity for me to seek out the best bottles. I'm getting some good access to some really good independent bottles right now.
So I've got one final question. What the hell is Harvey Fry doing to stay busy right now?
I've got him on lockdown. Basically, what I have him is completely in bubble wrap and a microbial room. Only one person is allowed to see Harvey. There's three of us that have been in a Scotch group together for years. I can't remember back to before then. It's Harvey, myself, and Roberto Cofino. And we were the three who got Jack Rose up and operational from a whiskey perspective. We were the three guys who worked the floor every night. We were and it was just like having a Scotch group. It was, I have to admit, those first 2 years with the three of us on the floor, for us, it was just like a party. It was the three of us every night having a tasting. So we've limited it to just Roberto getting him his medications, making sure he has food. He only has contact with one individual. We make sure that we keep a safe distance from Roberto just to make sure he's safe. That's the best thing we can do, is just keep him away from everyone. He had to celebrate. This was the first year we didn't celebrate his birthday here at Jack Rose in 11 years or 9 years, excuse me. So, I can't remember the last time I didn't celebrate his birthday with him or he with me. I mean, my birthday's coming up in 60 days. And I remember my 40th birthday. I'm hitting my 50th birthday coming up. And on my 40th birthday, I remember Harvey and I just cracking open 40-year-old bottles of Scotch on my birthday and drinking them. So it's going to be kind of a lonely, it's been, for all of us, we're normally there for each other's birthdays, and it's really weird.
Harvey Fry turned 82 years old on March 22nd, and one of the days when things get closer to something approximating normal, I want to get down to Jack Rose and sit down at the bar with Harvey for a drink or two. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlock, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlock lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's start off with the TX Barrel Proof Bourbon from Firestone and Robertson in Fort Worth, Texas. It's a 4-year-old bourbon bottled at 63.7% ABV. The nose has notes of charred oak, leather, dried fruits, honey, vanilla beans, and muted spices. The taste is spicy and intense with chili powder, cinnamon, and a hint of black pepper, balanced nicely by a subtle touch of campfire smoke and sweeter touches of honey and caramel candy. The finish is long and spicy, with a subtle but mouth-watering sweetness. I'm scoring the TX Barrel Proof Bourbon from Firestone and Robertson a 93. Bardstown Bourbon Company's Fusion Series No. 2 is made from 60% of the distillery's own young bourbon, in this case a combination of barrels from a rye recipe and a wheated recipe, along with 40% sourced 12-year-old Kentucky bourbon. It's bottled at 49.45% ABV. The nose has notes of red apples, honey, muted spices, and touches of chocolate and oak. The taste is spicy with black pepper and cinnamon notes that dominate the palate, along with a touch of caramel cola underneath and background hints of cherries, honey, and vanilla. Adding some water opens up fruity notes of red apples and peaches, while the finish is long and dry with lingering spices and hints of tree fruits. I'm scoring the Bardstown Bourbon Company's Fusion Series No. 2 a 90. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Rye whiskey was distilled by America's original risk-takers and history makers. Those first barrels of whiskey were bold, flavorful, and full of passion. Sagamore Spirit proudly picked up the torch with their spring-fed Maryland-style rye. It celebrates the grit and glory of those patriotic ancestors who sipped their way into American history. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com to explore their award-winning spirit, including the brand-new Calvados finish rye. Moving on now, Proximo's Tin Cup whiskey brand recently added a straight rye to its range. As with the Tin Cup bourbon, it's distilled at MGP in Indiana and reduced to 45% ABV with Colorado spring water. The nose has notes of baking spices, a hint of dill, and a slightly earthy character, along with a touch of brown sugar. The taste has good spicy touches of clove, cinnamon, and allspice, along with honey, vanilla, and brown sugar underneath. The finish is long with lingering spices, and I'm scoring the Tin Cup Straight Rye an 89. Finally, I mentioned the Laws Whiskey House San Luis Valley Bottled in Bond Rye from Colorado a couple of weeks ago in the news, and I received a sample the other day. It's bottled at 50% ABV. The nose has a good mix of baking spices and garden herbs, along with honey, vanilla, and charred oak. The taste is spicy with a nice balance between the baking spices, brown sugar, and honey notes, while hints of garden herbs come out slowly closer to the finish, which is long and well balanced too. If you add a bit of water, it opens up touches of red apples and dried flowers for a nice complexity, and I'm scoring the Laws Whiskey House San Luis Valley Rye a 92. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. I'm adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,800 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at WhiskyCast.com.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. It's brought to you by Lot 40. Every time we do a live webcast, there are audience questions and comments that we never quite get the time to get to. Part of that is because the chat window in the app we use to manage the live streams drops older comments as we go longer into the webcast. On Friday's Happy Hour webcast, one of the questions was about the first experiences our panelists had with whiskey. Now, you can watch the replays online to see what they said, but we had some great comments from the viewers online, and not all of them made it to the live webcast. For instance, Bruce Holland Fleisch posted this from Texas. Talisker, back in the 90s, and I think I liked it so much because my friends hated it. That way, no one would drink my whiskey. Smart thinking, Bruce. Klaus Dobelmann in Austria had a good teacher. My English teacher gave us a recipe for Irish coffee. I went out to buy whiskey, tried it neat, and the rest, as they say, is history. Ashley Penny chimed in from Ireland. First whiskey, Jameson. First Scotch, Famous Grouse. First USA, Old Grandad. Tor Christensen in Norway added this. Introduced my skeptic wife to whiskey with Dalwhinnie and chocolate. Worked great. Well, Tor is now making whiskey himself, so it must really have worked out well. Michael Johansson added this. My first whiskey that got me started collecting and enjoying the whiskey was Ardbeg Ugadal. And Irene Lau posted this from Canada. Powers. Someone brought it on a wine tour in Washington State. Super fond memories. Last time around, I talked with Japanese whiskey blogger Liam McNulty about the proposals being floated to create an official designation for Japanese whiskey that would require it actually be distilled in Japan. At Headstone on Twitter had this comment. Hi, Mark. I really enjoyed your pod today about Japanese whiskey. I'm glad to hear that the Japanese whiskey rules will hopefully be firmed up. It does leave you wondering about whether you're drinking the genuine article or something less palatable. We've done a lot of stuff about hand sanitizers in recent weeks. And while we try to keep politics out of the show, I could not resist this comment from whiskey PR maven Laura Pete in Virginia. I think you need to address the critical issue of lack of age statements on bleach bottles. I responded, maybe there's a new podcast series in this. How does BleachCast sound? We could also have bleach tasting notes, maybe even a bleach festival. Okay, seriously, people, don't drink bleach. And like a lot of people, I can't believe I have to say that out loud. Finally, one of the features on our live webcast is going around and asking our panelists what they have in their glasses. And here's what the Glenlivet's master distiller, Alan Winchester, told us on this week's Whiskey Wednesday webcast.
It's an Aberlour 10-year-old tonight. It's available locally in the cost cutters, so I bought a bottle of it this week as part of my emergency supplies. When things come back to normal, I'll probably stocking up on some 12 and 18-year-old Glenlivet. But a very nice dram, Aberlour 10-year-old.
For the record, Alan was the distillery manager at Aberlour earlier in his career, but his choice prompted this comment from @itinerante cata in Spanish. And here's the loose translation, thanks to Google Translate. Wonderful whiskey panel of experts at WhiskyCast, Alan Winchester drinking Aberlour 10 because that's what he found at Cost Cutter in an emergency purchase. So much humility. And one believes that the master distillers only drink limited editions. No, they drink regular whiskeys just like the rest of us. And sometimes they might even put ice in their whiskeys. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label. It's our look at the history, science, and all those other things that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. We all know that whiskey collecting is becoming more popular as an investment vehicle, but it also brings about a potential problem that many new collectors may not have thought about. What happens when your collection gets damaged? I got this email from Chris Williams in Maine the other day, and I bet you're going to sympathize with him. My basement was flooded with sewage recently. I had many bottles of single malt scotch that were damaged by the flooding. The insurance adjuster who inventoried the damages calculated the original price of each bottle, then reduced each bottle's value by 20% for depreciation. Am I correct in my thinking that a bottle of single malt scotch preserved properly does not depreciate in value? Well, technically, a bottle of whiskey should not depreciate in value if it hasn't been opened. But as with a lot of things in life, it all depends on who's determining the value. Now, this is one of those areas where I don't have a lot of expertise, except when it comes to that flooded basement part. So I do feel your pain, Chris. I took the question and put it to Joe Hyman, the whiskey specialist at Skinner Auctions in Boston. He specializes in valuing whiskeys, and after noting that insurance company adjusters are known for trying to pay out as little money as possible in claims, he said open bottles generally have little or no value in this situation, and there's nothing to stop the adjuster from valuing sealed bottles using the original cost instead of the replacement value. Essentially, in his words, the adjuster has you over a barrel.
It all depends on your homeowner's policy and how it's written and what's covered, what isn't covered, and many times things that are perishable items like wine and spirits are not covered unless you have a specific rider. And if you want that specific rider, then what ends up happening is you've got to have the whole appraisal done. And it's a long, laborious process and can run into thousands of dollars to get something like that done. And then they're going to want it done like every so often because you're drinking whiskey, you might drop a bottle here and there, whatever. There's attrition as well as you're expanding your collections. There's all kinds of things going on. So they want this stuff done every 2 to 3 years. And it might cost you $3,000 to $5,000 or more to get a whole thing, insurance appraisal done. And most people just don't do it because the time and money involved in doing it.
On top of that, the insurance company might require that you store your whiskeys in a locked cabinet or even outside of your home in a climate-controlled warehouse as a condition of coverage. If you have valuable whiskeys and don't feel the need to have them on display at home, there are specialized wine storage facilities in many cities that offer secured storage and may even include the cost of insurance in their fees. Joe's advice, if you live in a flood-prone area, store your whiskeys and other valuables as high as you can above ground level. And if your whiskey room is in the basement, as ours is here in the WhiskyCast studio, there is one other thing to keep in mind. For a while, we had been storing some of the whiskeys on the workbench in the adjacent laundry room, until our insurance agent came by to do an inspection at renewal time. He looked at those whiskeys, then at the natural gas-fired boiler and water heater 10 feet away with pilot lights near the floor, then pointed out that if, say, one of the cats happened to knock a bottle or two off the workbench, the alcohol vapors could be ignited by the pilot lights, and, in his words, the whole house could go up like a meth lab. Needless to say, we had to move the bottles to a safer place before he would renew the homeowner's policy. The moral of the story, when you are deciding just how to store your whiskeys, take a few minutes to look around and ask yourself, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? Then figure out how to keep that from ever happening, especially if you're using those whiskeys as some form of an investment. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, and, of course, a complete archive of all of our past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. We love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2020, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.